everyone. This is Daniel from the Particular Baptist Podcast. Now, most people today don't realize how many mortgage options they actually have or how easy it is to choose the wrong one. And that's where Lane Campbell comes into the picture. Instead of pushing you into a specific loan, he helps you understand your options and what makes sense for your particular situation. If you're buying a home, refinancing, or just want a second opinion, you can call or text Lane at 618-671-1830. Again, that's 618-671-1830. NMLS number 2413537. Edge Home Finance. NMLS number 891464. Equal housing lender. Now, on to another great episode of the Particular Baptist Podcast. Thank you. Good evening at this point. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Particular Baptist Podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Vincent. You can find us and other podcasts at reformpodcast.com. Also, check out our blog at theparticularbaptist.net. And if you'd like to support our ministry, you can become a patron by heading over to patreon.com/the particular Baptist. All right. So we're going to be diving into a touchy subject among Baptists, especially religious liberty. And I saw this clip from, actually, initially I saw I think it was a meme or a screenshot or something, a post on Facebook related to this, where John MacArthur had talked about religious freedom and that he did not stand for religious freedom, that Christians should not stand for religious freedom. And that caught my attention because that's not something that you find typically among Baptist or Baptistic-like people. They tend to be very much in favor of religious freedom, especially if you live in the United States. And I was actually quite surprised to hear MacArthur talk about religious freedom in this way. And of course, it's based John MacArthur. You know, he's being quite controversial as he typically is, making strong stances on what he believes and things of that nature. But something I think worth talking about, and I'm going to play the clip that actually came from this, or that this came from, because it was from a sermon he did, I guess not too long ago. It looks like he's fairly elderly in this clip. It's certainly not an old sermon by any stretch of the imagination. But I want to take a look at it, just this clip real quick. This is from, if you go on Twitter, it's from a post from July 3rd, 2026. It got a lot of attention because of the topic, has over 106,000 views. It's been shared many, many times, a lot of likes, etc. So certainly something that went around and people were talking about, but it's only 42 seconds. So I'll play it real quick.
No Christian with half a brain would say, we support religious freedom. I read the other day that the new administration will uphold religious freedom. Really? I don't even support religious freedom. Religious freedom is what sends people to hell. To say I support religious freedom is to say I support idolatry. It's to say I support lies. I support hell. I support the kingdom of darkness. You can't say that. We support the truth. No Christian.
So, of course, that clip got quite a bit of attention because of the nature of it. Again, in this country, especially during this time of year, this is the 250th anniversary of American independence. And so you do see, things like this going around, and it gets people's attention. Certainly got mine, for sure. So, this season of 250 Years of America, these type of topics tend to come up for discussion. And, what's interesting about this, it does bring up questions surrounding the history of our country and what was the thought process as it relates to religious liberty at the time. I want to look at that some. Of course, I want to look at it from a particular Baptist perspective to some extent. And, we're answering the question, is religious freedom biblical? Now, I'll start off with saying that, of course, I agree with MacArthur. We should not be in support of idolatry as Christians. We should not be in support of pagan religions. We should be in support of the truth, as he says. Completely agree with that. And I don't believe that religious liberty, absolute religious liberty of all religions, all beliefs, I don't believe that is ideal. Religious liberty, as we understand it in modernity, in the Western world, and in an Enlightenment sense, is certainly not ideal. If our ideal of society is that we are to promote and support all religions as if they're on equal playing fields in a society, I don't believe that is right. However, I do believe, as James Baird, who we reviewed his book, King of Kings, he's pointed this out before, political work is messy, and that all situations are not as clear in terms of what to do from a civil perspective. Now, what you can gather from that is that prudence is in order in terms of how a country is to handle these situations, and they're not always very clear on how to handle these different situations. It might be good to leave the modern understanding of religious liberty in place to keep the peace, at least for a time, while working toward state government promotion and maybe even some sort of religious culturalism, if you will, where Christianity is promoted in such a way that paganism is just, it's ostracized just by cultural promotion of Christianity. It's just not seen as something to even worth pursuing because the culture just doesn't allow it, even if it's not outlawed per se. That's certainly a way that you can do that. And maybe even some sort of specific promotion of Protestantism over even Roman Catholicism. So I think that, what he's saying in terms of religious liberty, that Christians should not be thinking that religious freedom is something that we support. I would say, yes, ideally that's the case. But I do think in terms of it being a means to an end of keeping the peace, which is the goal of government, and government moving toward the end of suppressing pagan religion and toward promoting Christianity, I think that it can be a means to the end. I don't think it's black or white, all or nothing. Again, I think James Baird's principles of wisdom and prudence and other things have to come into play in terms of those things. I don't know if he would come to that same conclusion, but I think the principle can be applied in that way. And it's interesting when you look at the history of our country, civil liberty, and I'm using Baird quite a bit here. I'm not saying, I want to be clear, I'm not saying that he necessarily comes to my conclusions on these principles, but he does provide a lot of good historical and practical principles that can be used as we're thinking through these messy and not so straightforward issues. But civil liberty, which is really foundational to religious liberty in the United States, was not considered absolute toleration of all religions or actions, but it was the freedom to choose with the right constraints in place so that one could choose what was good for society, not what was bad. Now, James Baird has pointed out that we tend to think of liberty in the West, or at least in the American mindset, we tend to think of liberty as the ability to choose the negative, right? Oh, I don't have to choose Christianity. I have the freedom to choose to be a Hindu or something like that. He's saying, no, that's not what our country was founded on with those principles. Okay. It wasn't the choice to be a Hindu or a Muslim or an atheist. It was a choice to choose what was for the public good. That's so like you, and even if you want to take it in a practical way, you couldn't choose to go and kill somebody, right? Freedom didn't mean it was anarchy, where it was every man for himself. It was it put the right constraints and the right guardrails in place to allow people to make choices for the public good. The government was not saying specifically what the public good was in every case. You had liberty to choose what that looked like for you, and to some extent, right, as long as it was for the overall public good. And this wasn't some arbitrary goodness that was being understood here. And this is from James Baird. This is from his book King of Kings. He said, quote, at the time of the founding, Americans thought about civil freedom in a similar way, and referring to what he was talking about earlier in this chapter. Civil freedom meant the liberty to choose the public good, not the public evil. To our modern ears, this idea sounds foreign and strange. We tend to define freedom negatively. We see freedom as the lack of limits. You're free if nothing keeps you from doing what you want. But that's not how the founders thought about freedom. They defined freedom not as the absence of constraints, but as the presence of the right constraints. People experience true liberty when their piety, religion, and morality compel them to do what is good for their community. So the guardrails, the system, the environment is in place for them to choose what is for the public good, and it actually compels them to do so. It's not the ability to do whatever you want, which is a huge problem. And that's from pages 76 and 77 of the Kindle edition, if you want to go look it up. But that's the modern mindset, the freedom to do whatever I want. So in terms of religious liberty, that's how we tend to view it. Oh, the First Amendment says the government can't establish religion. So therefore I can choose whatever religion I want. That's not what liberty was. Civil liberty is the foundation of religious liberty. And if civil liberty is not absolute, then neither can religious liberty that society was formulated in part on can have absolute liberty. There has to be constraints in place for the promotion of the public good. Now, looking at one of our founding fathers, John Adams, he made it clear that liberty, as enshrined in the Constitution, was not for anyone but a, quote, moral and religious people. He knew that the people that this country was for people who at least had some belief in God in some sense. They were religious, right? This wasn't an absolute, paganism and all those things. This was for Christian people and people who lived morally, right? It wasn't anarchy. Okay, so this wasn't absolute freedom to do whatever you wanted, but for those who believed in God. Now, of course, Adams he wasn't Orthodox. He wasn't an Orthodox Christian. My understanding is that he was Unitarian. But the point is that he even saw Christian practice, at least loosely defined, as a necessary precondition to this American experiment to work. It couldn't function in a society run by relativism and religious agnosticism, right? That would just crumble a society. People's virtue had to flow from its understanding of God, right? It wasn't arbitrary virtue for virtue's sake. It was virtue that came from God himself. And so the people who were governed, who were living in this country, had to have those basic principles in place in order to be able to make this society work. It wasn't built for anyone else. That's why you see society crumble when you have relativism, when you have a strong push against authority and the natural order. It starts to crumble because it's rejecting the God who gave those laws and what the society was built on in the first place. Now, of course, when you talk about liberty of conscience, private faith obviously was preserved. Government can't reach into your conscience. It can only regulate what's outwardly done in society. But even in private, it wasn't it wasn't the freedom to be Hindu or Buddhist. This was primarily, at least, to be for the worship of God. That there could be differences in that. You can see this, and Baird gives a really good example in the for the New Hampshire state constitution, which declared that men could worship God according to his conscience. There's nothing in there about pagan religions. It's worshiping God according to his conscience. This was to allow different Christian sects to be able to worship according to their conscience. So even in private, pagans are not seen as comporting with American Christian society. At least this Christian understanding of cultural Christianity, to borrow the cliche, right? Where you had these general Christian principles, you had people who were very religious minded, not necessarily, even if they weren't necessarily believers, but this was not something that there's this general mindset of Christianity within the culture. And if you want to point to Thomas Jefferson was kind of a weirdo when it came to these things. He was a bit of an outlier, if you will. At least that's the way I see the historical evidence. 'Cause, I mean, he was, for instance, he took interest in Islam. He bought a Quran. He owned one, and he did seem sympathetic toward Muslims as it relates to freedom, religious toleration. So, again, Jefferson seems to be a little bit more of an outlier when it comes to these things, and was a bit more progressive, if you will, as it relates to religious freedom. I mean, Jefferson was also known for editing the Bible. He was a deist. He was an immoral man. And of course, he wasn't the only one who was immoral, but he just was not your token Christian. He's not someone you would think of as, oh yeah, that's a man of good character. No, he was not. So there's some issues there. But what you find generally is this mindset that Christianity is the foundation in terms of the religious mindset of the nation. Now, a really interesting character that Baird brings up in his book is Joseph Story. Now, I did some digging into the source material that he provided. Joseph Story, he was a Supreme Court justice. He was appointed by James Madison. That is Joseph Story, interpreted the First Amendment to be a way to promote Christianity, not to allow all religions as if they were equally valid. And it's interesting, too, you see some of these historical ties. James Madison was the one who proposed the Bill of Rights in the first place. And so you see a Supreme Court justice appointed by Madison interpreting the amendment that his president provided in the first place. And you can, if you look at Book 3 of Story's Commentaries on the Constitution of the United States, he talks a bit about this. I'll read a little bit here. This is from section 1867. He said, "Now there will be found few persons in this or any other Christian country," calls America a Christian country, "who would deliberately contend that it was unreasonable or unjust to foster and encourage the Christian religion generally as a matter of sound policy as well as of revealed truth. In fact, every American colony, from its foundation down to the Revolution, with the exception of Rhode Island, if indeed the state be an exception, did openly, by the whole course of its laws and institutions, support and sustain in some form the Christian religion, and almost invariably gave a peculiar sanction to some of its fundamental doctrines. And this has continued to be the case in some of the states down to the present period, without the slightest suspicion that it was against the principles of public law or Republican liberty. So you can see at the state level, there was more of a promotion of Christianity than at the federal level, obviously, because you have the First Amendment. But this was not seen as incompatible because of the structure that was in place that was related to the federal government. But Story calls America a Christian nation, and that these things were established at the beginning. Again, this is a Supreme Court justice interpreting a legal document. He's giving legal, this is the interpretation of it, he's saying. Section 1868, he says, probably at the time of the adoption of the Constitution and of the amendment to it, now under consideration, the general, if not the universal sentiment in America was that Christianity ought to receive encouragement from the state, so far as was not incompatible with the private rights of conscience and the freedom of religious worship. An attempt to level all religions and to make it a matter of state policy to hold all in utter indifference would have created universal disapprobation, if not universal indignation. So you say when America was founded, this ridiculous idea that all religions were on some sort of equal playing field. But notice there's a difference in promoting religion from the state level and letting people worship according to conscience, because the state can't regulate that, right? Or promote it in that way. Those were seen as two completely separate things and completely compatible with one another. And then he goes on to say in 1871, he says, the real object of the amendment was not to countenance, much less to advance Mohammedanism, Islam, or Judaism, or infidelity by prostrating Christianity, but to exclude all rivalry among Christian sects and to prevent any national ecclesiastical establishment, which should give to an hierarchy the exclusive patronage of the national government. It thus cut off the means of religious persecution, the vice and pests of former ages, and of the subversion of the rights of conscience in matters of religion, which had been trampled upon almost from the days of the apostles to the present age. And then he goes on to talk about how the Church of England persecuted those of religious descent in England, which is interesting. So he's grounding the history of the understanding of conscience, talking about those who were persecuted who claimed the name of Christ, not everyone in general. And he specifically says Mohammedanism, Judaism, were not considered in this amendment. This is Christianity, or at least, what resembles it. So we can see religious liberty at the federal level had nothing to do with allowing anything that calls itself by modern terms religious, but to promote Christian religious activities without having some sort of establishmentarianism. It was to allow Christian sects to be able to worship according to conscience. But you see, even at the state level, in some cases, there was the promotion of only the Protestant religion, as Story points out in another place about Massachusetts. But at the federal level, that could have been expanded. But it's clear that the government was not in any way meant to promote, even the federal government with religious liberty without establishment was not promoting Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, or other pagan practice. Is interpreted to be a way to allow Christian sects to worship according to conscience. Very interesting when you dive into the history of these things and you look at primary source material on our nation's founding. And what's interesting is these principles of religious freedom, as understood to be Christians worshiping according to conscience, not everybody who comes up and says they believe in the spaghetti monster or believe that there are nymphs in the trees, crazies like that. That's not what it's talking about. This echoes what, like, our particular Baptists, who are Reformed Baptists, the particular Baptist forefathers who wanted freedom of conscience to worship God, how they were convicted without the government requiring them to worship in a certain way, worship God in a certain way. And we've clearly taught on the fact that particular Baptists, as a consensus, did not believe in absolute religious freedom like the General Baptists did or the Anabaptist. They did not believe in that stuff. We've dealt with that at length. You can look at our blog. We've done multiple episodes on the subject. Go back and listen to those things to address that. But it's clear that you can see this idea of particular Baptists at the General Assembly of 1689. Kiffin, Knollys, and Keach, those were three signers of the 1689, by the way, and 21 other particular Baptists said this about the Protestant religion. They said, quote, "It being our professed judgment, and we on all occasions shall manifest the same, to venture our all for the Protestant religion and the liberties of our native country. And we do with great thankfulness to God acknowledge his special goodness to these nations in raising up our present King William to be a blessed instrument in his hand to deliver us from popery and arbitrary power, and shall always, as in duty bound, pray that the Lord may continue him and his royal consort long to be a blessed to these kingdoms, and shall always be ready to the utmost of our ability in our place to join our hearts and hands with the rest of our Protestant brethren for the preservation of the Protestant religion and the liberties of the nation." So they want the Protestant religion to be promoted by the king, by the nation. They want this Protestantism to be pushed. So religious liberty is not about everybody being able to worship however they want just because they have an inkling to worship whatever they want. This is about worshiping God in the Protestant way, at least from these multiple particular Baptists. I mean, it's a total of 24 particular Baptists signed this and promoted it. You can find this in the minutes of the 1689 General Assembly. It's found in Faith and Life for Baptists, edited by James Renahan. But Baptists, particular Baptists, have wanted there to be government promotion of the Protestant religion. They did not see absolute toleration of everything as something to be what the state should be doing. So they believed it was for the public good to suppress popery and promote Protestantism, and that as Baptists, they should be at liberty to choose the good and not be forced to do that which they were convicted of was evil, which the government had no control over being in their conscience, which was about the worship of God. We want to worship God according to our conscience, what our convictions are. They weren't saying that Muslims now could worship according to their quote unquote conscience. That's not at all what they're referring to. They wanted popery suppressed, the Protestant religion preserved in line with liberty of conscience. And even if you jump forward a number of years into the 18th century, you have the American Baptist Isaac Backus, who interestingly enough is used to promote the idea of absolute religious liberty. But he was far from that, as we're going to see here. He talks in his work, actually, there's a work he did on what religious liberty is. And it had nothing to do with, I'm glad that our country lets demon worshipers like Hindus build giant monkey statues in Texas. That had nothing to do with that. This is from a work he did on religious liberty. He talks about what true liberty is. He says, quote, "The true liberty of man is to know, obey, and enjoy his creator, and to do all the good unto and enjoy all the happiness with and in his fellow creatures that he is capable of in order to which the law of love was written in his heart, which carries in its nature union and benevolence to being in general, and to each being in particular, according to its nature and excellence, and to its relation and connection to the Supreme Being and ourselves. Each rational soul, as he is a part of the whole system of rational beings, so it was and is both his duty and his liberty to regard the good of the whole in all his actions, to love ourselves and truly to seek our own welfare is both our liberty and our indispensable duty. But the conceit that man could advance either his honor or happiness by disobedience instead of obedience was first injected by the father of lies, and all such conceits ever since are as false as he is. And that last section there is key. It said it's conceit given by Satan himself that that true liberty in a civil sense has anything to do with the ability to choose that which is against the public good or that which is evil. So sin was not an option for true liberty to exist in a nation. And you even see the order of loves that kind of calls back to you see this kind of basic Thomistic framework of the order of loves, right? Man is to love according in his relationship to God, in relationship to ourselves, and our relations, right? Which is very Thomistic in principle, which I find very interesting. There's not this blanket flat modern concept of love where everyone tries to uh, find equality in terms of social status. It's love according to relation to ourselves, to God, and making sure that we're promoting the public good, right? Which, of course, choosing pagan religions is completely against that. But it's just really interesting when you dive into the history here and bringing this all the way back to John MacArthur. What MacArthur is highlighting is a topic that is just completely misunderstood today. I mean, I to be fair, in more recent times, I've come to a better understanding of these things, but it took me having to read primary source material, step outside of my in group, if you will, and go to the out group and read these things. Oh, wow, the founding fathers said this. Oh, wow, our Baptist fathers said this. Oh, wow, my understanding of these things is actually off. And I need to refine my understanding based on, I say I believe in the First Amendment. Well, what does that mean? I say I believe in Baptist political theology. Well, I need to have a better understanding of what that means, you know? So it's been an interesting study, and it is encouraging when you hear, I mean, you just don't hear people talk like that, like MacArthur. And MacArthur was a gifted preacher. Of course, it's Reformed Baptist. We have significant disagreements, but he was a man of God. I will worship with him in heaven, and I'm thankful for his ministry on earth and for his bold preaching and stance for the truth. I mean, that's a very bold thing to say in modern day conservative America, where you will have many who will balk at that, like, "Whoa, what are you saying, John? Wait, you don't like religious liberty?" It's definitely going to ruffle some feathers from saying that, and it clearly did. It caused a stir with that clip. Of course, that's an older sermon, but when you put things in clips, you highlight certain things better than others, and it catches people's attention. So it's interesting to to see those things, but these are important topics we need to talk about. Recovering the art of studying primary source material is so important, and it's something that we've just, especially in church history, we've lost. We've highlighted that I don't know how many times on this show, the importance of going back to primary source material, reading old dead guys, how easy it is now to go read these things and pull up these things just by being resourceful, right? And not relying solely on secondary source material to tell us what this person said about what. We just have the ability now to be able to read these things and study these things for ourselves. And we should be. We should be. Even if we disagree with them, we should be studying them and understanding them and expanding, our knowledge and understanding of these things. So definitely been an interesting study, a very eye opening, especially reading Joseph's story, the Supreme Court appointee from Madison, and just how openly and explicitly Christian the First Amendment actually was, and just being kind of taken aback, like, wow, you're raised in the United States, you're taught about the First Amendment in such a progressive anti-Christian way, but when you study its history, you find out that it actually was meant to be a way to promote Christianity, not promote wickedness. And that really helps us, I think, it eases those tensions, because it's easy to say, well, okay, I live in a country that promotes religious freedom, but how do I reconcile that with, I don't want to promote monkey demon statues, right, in Texas. Well, let's understand what was meant by those things, right, and have a biblical understanding. See, and you can see that our founding fathers were really just pulling from early Protestantism, right? Even if multiples of them weren't uh, actually Christians, but you do see these concepts. Even with the Enlightenment, it didn't drown out the basic principles of what freedom of religion and liberty of conscience meant, really coming from our Baptist forefathers quite a bit. Maybe some of the other separatists in the Puritan movement and in Presbyterianism, maybe, but I think you really see it among the particular Baptists, right, who tried to find a proper balance between government promoting religion and having a proper place for that, right, that didn't encroach upon the church's role in the kingdom of in the heavenly kingdom of God, but also understanding that Christians are to be able to worship civilly according to their conscience, right? Even if there are real disagreements between them, like the Paedo Baptists and particular Baptists, but being able to, as long as they are, um, Orthodox Christians, being able to worship freely without being persecuted by the state. So very interesting study. And just from that 42-second clip, it causes such a rich discussion and something that we should continue to have in our as Christians as we try to work through. They are real issues that we have to work through. I don't want to downplay that. It's been ingrained in our minds that religious freedom is a certain way, and that's the modern liberal mindset and progressiveness that tries to be indifferent to everything. There's really no standard that they give. Of course, they have an implicit standard, but there's really no standard in terms of what they try to output. Everything's the same, everything's equally valid, it doesn't matter. We all have to respect everyone's religion, right? Instead of, actually standing for the truth. So, it's a very interesting study. It's certainly something that doesn't get removed from our psyches easily. It's something that we have to study and work through and wrestle with. Okay, what do we do in this situation? What do we do in that situation? There's just a lot to think about as it relates to this topic. But anyways, a lot of good stuff here. Um, I would encourage you to go read James Baird's book. I did a review on it on the show um, a number of months ago, and James Baird watched it. He promoted the review as well, and it's a very helpful book. Very helpful. Provides some. It's a good primer on understanding the principles of government and the church and the relationship between the two, and then how that works in an American context. Very helpful. Well, anyways, I hope everyone has a great rest of your day and week. And Lord willing, we'll be back next week.